So someone posted a question in an improv group not too long ago, and it got me thinking enough that I wanted to do a whole episode of my answer. Welcome back to your improv brain. I'm booting up the podcast to answer a question I saw in an improv forum. Yeah, that's right. You heard that right. The question, roughly, was how much weight do you put on the different ways people learn improv? Whether that's actually like doing scenes themselves, watching other people perform, or kind of the more conceptual side of improv theory, like discussion and reading books. And how do you balance those things when you teach improv? I mean, if you've been listening to any of the show, you're probably like, yeah, that makes sense. Jen would reboot a whole podcast just to answer this in detail in a monologue. And if you're new here, that's who you're dealing with right now. Now, you can apply this, my answer to learning improv at any phase. If you're a beginner, you're early on, or you're later on, you've done a whole lot of improv and you're listening to this. But you could also apply it to learning how to do all sorts of things. So if you want to listen to this through the lens of learning in general, it should probably work. Like if you're working on improving your voice or presence on a podcast, for example, if you're learning how to give presentations at work, or how to become a teacher of improv or dance fitness or anything like that, a whole lot more. So you can apply this to a lot of things. And my short answer, by the way, I'll link to this in the description, that doing improv, actually doing the craft, comes first by a lot. I mean, you probably could have guessed that. It's probably your answer too. Doing improv is a great way to learn improv. Performing it in classes or jams or shows, or creating your own stuff with it. That's a great way to learn how to improvise. Stuff like that. After that, after the performance part, doing improv. After that, I would say watching veteran improvisers. This is improvisers who are just further along than you in their skills to some degree. This is very useful. Really paying attention to what they do. Like, this is what moves they make. Great new moves that you might want to try. Watching that improv through the lens of figuring out what you like, the style, those kind of moves, those kinds of forms. All of this can help inform your taste and your own style, along with growing your skill set through learning. Like, what do you want to focus on learning, right? What did you see in that show that's really great that you want to focus your learning on? Super, super useful. So then, in my answer on that post that I will link, then I added the thing that I actually want to talk about today, that I rebooted this podcast for, because I added only a very high level brief note about it, because it wasn't one of the options in the question. This is the kind of learning I think is maybe the most underused in improv, maybe because it's often misunderstood because of some of our improv canon and teaching. And it can be some of the most useful work you can do out there. And this is specifically taking a careful look back at your own experience in those scenes on your own, in the time between your classes and your sets, and your rehearsals and your shows, in a very intentional, constructed way. That's the key. And then you use that experience that you had thinking about your improv to inform how you can operate in your own improv brain. And then you'll end up taking that into your scenes on autopilot without thinking in your scenes. So you're still outside your head. Now, the technical word for this thing is metacognition, being metacognitive. And I've done a number of episodes on it because I'm interested in this thing, and I went ahead with them, even though I knew they would probably do very poorly on the show, because why would anyone do an episode about that? Metacognition just means thinking about your own thinking, paying attention to how your own mind actually works. So yeah, it's a little bit recursive, but please stay with me. If you're still here, it's really the whole point of your improv brain as a show. It's really my central thesis, which is why I answered that way. And it's why I came back to do this episode. So for us, it means looking at or thinking about how you specifically operate in improv in a very intentional and almost like constructed way, right? So what you did in a scene, why you might have done that thing that you did, what was going on for you in that moment, what would you want to do differently next time, and what would you want to do exactly the same next time? How do you think in improv? How do you do your half of the scene? How do you add to a scene, for example? What kinds of things get you out of tight spots or problems? How does getting out of your head really work for you? How does it feel? Because all of our heads are very different, and we can let go for a lot of this stuff. But I do believe it really helps to look at and consider this stuff between the scenes in a very intentional way to get really good in them when you're doing the scenes. So you aren't ever thinking of this stuff in the scene, ever, never. But pre-thinking about your scenes in this way means you don't have to. It gets you out of your head. And as such, it will happen. You're learning. You're thinking about these things. You're like, I want to do more of this. And then that more will just happen on its own without thinking in the scene. And that's how metacognition helps us in improv be in the moment and take advantage of all those reps. So the part that makes this intentional thinking work is specifically that you do it between your sets, between your scenes, after the set is over, on the drive home, the next morning, whenever you have a spare minute or a spare few hours to yourself, depending on how much thinking you want to do, depending on what kind of human being you are. While you're actually in a scene, you are present in the moment with your scene partner. There's no room for this kind of analysis there. So all this looking happens later on. So a lot of my show, Your Improv Brain, this podcast that you're listening to and hopefully still happy about, is about getting out of your head. And yes, I'm here telling you to think about improv on purpose with intention. And this is because this time between scenes, this is when the thinking really helps you out, because that's the only place you can kind of just step back from yourself, from these scenes, and start seeing patterns across a whole bunch of scenes at once, right? And you can't do this from inside a single scene, and it's harder for other people to do this for you, right? And they aren't inside your head. They don't know how it feels. So the looking back that you do afterwards is part of what lets you stay out of your head when it's really important to stay out of your head. Your brain is going to go on autopilot, essentially, with all that self-learning and analysis and thinking that's up there, right? Because it will kind of get like muscle memory in a way. It's why you don't need to think about the yes and. You kind of just committing these things into muscle memory outside of the scene as well. So part of this thing is reps, and part of this thing is thinking. Yes, but there are some important caveats here, some gotchas, and some things that you might not want to do. So this is around replaying the scene or the set in your head because you didn't like what happened and you're cringing about that thing, about whatever happened, because that a lot of times, if you're just really stuck in that emotional kind of place about a scene, it's not going to teach you much. And it could have some negative repercussions. And by could, I mean probably it's going to have some negative repercussions, right? So you might need a bit more distance from that scene before you can take an analytical and henceforth helpful look at that scene. If you need to at all, you might just forget about it, right? Like it might not be useful. But if you think it might be useful, you might want that distance to become unemotional about that scene. The other one, and this is probably the most important caveat here, do not compare yourself to others. Do not think about their moves. Like, don't get into that thing where it's like, well, if they didn't mess that up, I would have done a great scene. Like, don't do any of that. So this is really a personal look at where you are, what you are putting into the scene, how your brain is working, how you feel if you feel things about that scene, how you respond to things as opposed to whatever is handed to you in that scene. You're just thinking about the response to that. So we've got those caveats out of the way. So what do you get out of this activity? Why are we thinking about how we think in improv? So over time, this is how you can work out what improv actually is for you. You start to see which notes to take to heart and which notes to just kind of let go of, to set aside, because not every note is for you, right? You're going to get those notes that just don't apply to your head. Like, hey, Jen, it might be helpful to put an emotional label on that thing. I cannot use emotional labels. So that's a note I can toss away. I did not even understand that until I started doing this practice. In fact, I didn't even realize I was alexithymic as a human being until I started doing this kind of thing in improv. And then it helped me so much about all those emotional scenes that I was sweating over. All those learning, all those exercises I never got anything out of, and I had no idea why. I figured it all out doing this thing. That's why I'm a fan of it. So you watch your own style forming and you doing this sort of thing. And you can learn how you say, for example, tend to edit, how you work within a team, how you learn, like that whole alexithymia thing I just tangented on and didn't expect to in this episode. You learn how you learn. You learn the way that you respond when a scene gets really hard. You learn about your nervous system. You learn about how you best function, for example, in a certain type of scene, like a group scene. That was a tough one for me. You know when something just goes tits up on stage or off stage. You know how and what you best offer to improv in general. You know what you best offer as a human doing this thing. You build a real picture of yourself as an improviser from the inside. And that picture is worth a whole lot more than most of the general advice anyone else, like a coach or teacher, can hand you, because it's specifically about you. Basically, you can give yourself the best personal notes if you figure out how to give them in a very positive, fair, and constructive way. And that's by not comparing yourself to the other people. That's why I went on about that for so long and sounded so serious about it. Because that's how you're going to get this thing going really good for you. Anyways, when I started thinking about my improv thinking, that's a sentence, I noticed it can like just cut down that comparison stuff and the self-criticism quite a bit. Like when your attention is on what you bring and how you can be a better teammate, there's a whole lot less room for that rumination spiral thing where you're like stack ranking yourself up against the other people in the scene or the room or your team or the class or whatever. And then you come out feeling really rotten or feeling rotten about the other people. That's not good either. When you're curious, like really genuinely curious about your own practice, what you're doing, when you're curious about how you can be the happiest, most healthiest improviser in the room, maybe, that means the most for you in this thing. And it's going to keep you doing improv in a very healthy way. It's not selfish. This thing is not selfish. You are thinking all about you, but it's not selfish because doing so is going to help you have your scene partners back in the best way possible. It's how you can make them shine the best by knowing how you fit in the scene the best with them to support them. You know how to support your scene partner the best this way. For a long time, I'll give you an example about the group scene thing. I beat myself up about those group scenes, and in certain kind of sets as well. Like I'd beat myself up how I was participating in certain sets in certain ways, because group conversations are really hard for me in real life, so they were hard for me in improv too. Go figure. I'd beat myself up until I'd done enough of this thing, the detailed looking back, to actually see what I was the strongest at, what I was the most comfortable at in these scenes, what I best offered to these group scenes, for example. I used to really struggle in. So I stopped beating myself up about not being like the other people in those scenes. I was like, how are they doing that? How do I do that thing? Well, I don't do that thing, right? I can offer something else. And that's what I learned by doing this. And this wasn't a note I ever got from anyone else, because no one was up in my head, in my noggin, knowing what I felt comfortable at and what I was struggling at. At least for those scenes, they can see other things, but they couldn't see that, right? So I gave that note to myself through this analysis. So this is where this idea of thinking about your own practice in a very intentional, constructed way ties into nearly everything I talk about on this Hell and E show. Doing this thing well means learning your own improv brain, your preferences, the things that reliably trip you up because of the way that you are individually wired in your noggin, the way that your nervous system reacts under pressure, and maybe even more about your own neurotype, because you have one. You might start understanding your neurotype a heck of a lot better if you do this activity. And if you're neurodivergent, like I am, the more likely it is that standard advice you get in classes and with coaches was not necessarily built with your wiring in mind. So the picture that you're going to get building yourself up, figuring yourself out this way, is going to help. Now, this is tough, because you do have to fill in those gaps that you might not be getting in the notes. But this work, it's tough, but it also can be so rewarding and so fun, not just for improv, but all those other areas of life as well. So you might be forming a picture, you might be forming a list, a checklist, or whatever is the resource that tells you which usual improv rules you can keep and which ones you need to adjust for how your brain is actually operating, which you're learning by doing this particular practice. So a couple more gotchas here that you might want to think about. This might not click for everyone, because this whole core concept of how our noggins work and operate differently, this means that you might not like to think this way, and that's fair. You don't got to do it. And this also might not be where you start off. Like if you're fairly new to learning improv, like when you're brand new, you need all that time before there's enough stuff to look back on and understand it. This activity made a big difference for me in my improv learning when I was taking classes. As soon as I got to thinking about how I personally operated outside of those notes, I started noticing, that note totally doesn't work for me. Why? And when I started answering those questions, a lot more things started to make sense. Some people are going to get a lot from a really brief, quick look back after a set. They might make one note for themselves or notice one thing and then just move on and stop thinking. Whereas some people, not naming any names, you have to figure out what your own brain wants, which is the whole theme of this show, if you haven't noticed. Now take a quick wild guess about which one of those two things I am. Anyways, just make sure you focus on your own brain only. No comparing yourself to other people. If you take one thing from that episode, please take that one thing. So after your next class or set, give yourself at least 10, let's say 10 uninterrupted minutes. Later that day, next morning, whatever. Pick one scene that just kind of stuck out for you. Could be good, could be rough. Either of those things will work. Just consider it unemotional. Like when you're thinking about the scene, be quite unemotional about it. If you can't be, pick a different scene, and then just focus on your own brain. Also, I do have a post-session reflection sheet. It's attached as a link on every newsletter that I send out. You can download that and you can use that to just make some quick notes to remember those scenes so you can do this processing later on. Then, when you're doing this processing, just walk yourself through a few questions about that scene. Things like, what did I actually do in that scene? What was I going for? What was going on with me before I made that choice? What choices felt good? What things might you want to repeat and do again? What things might you change and avoid for the future? Would I maybe change something about a skill? What was I feeling in these moments? But the main thing that you do want to focus on here is, what do these things tell me about how I work and how I operate? What do they tell me about how my brain is functioning in these moments with these choices or these moves? Just be curious more than anything, and don't be judgmental. So curious the most, judgmental the least. And then write down anything if writing helps you think, or say them out loud to yourself. That helps it get in that noggin and marinate so that the things that you want to do come out in the scene. Just do this a handful of times across a few weeks and see what parts of this process work, parts of the process you want to keep, and what parts of this process you want to toss away. And then notice those patterns. Notice the patterns that you wouldn't get from looking at a single scene or a single set. Now, if doing this feels like a lot, oh, this is a huge assignment. My God, why did I listen to this episode this far in? It's actually, this is how I'm going to be running some off-script workshops. That's what I'm calling them, off-script. This is where we're going to set an intention at the top of the workshop, and we're going to look at the things that kind of shifted for your brain by the end. So this sort of reflection has a little bit of structure built around it, and you're not doing it all alone on your own. Now, the focus is almost entirely on your own brain for these growths, not like yes and stuff like that. I'm not giving you notes on that. You're looking at your personal brain growth doing improv. If that sounds useful, there's information in the description. So that's about it. Hopefully this might help you in your improv learning. Maybe it's inferred, but I rarely see this mentioned as something to do with very careful intention and a little bit of structure around it. But there it is. I'm getting it out there. I'm Jen deHaan, and this is your Improv Brain. Maybe that's obvious to everyone, all this stuff. Anyway, you can find more improv resources and my newsletter over at improvupdate.com, which is going to be changing to your improvbrain.com. It'll just forward there, so you don't need to worry. Type either of those things in, and you should find the resources. I'll see you in another episode. I'll make another one. All right. Bye for now.